Here's a question worth sitting with. When did Switzerland invent time? Well, the answer's never. They didn't invent it and they don't control it, of course. For most of the history, they weren't even particularly concerned by it. And yet, somehow, this landlocked country of around 8 million people convinced the entire world that they are the final authority on timekeeping. Not China, who actually invented mechanical clocks, and not Britain, who built an empire on maritime navigation and precision chronometers. Switzerland, a country that stayed neutral through 2 world wars, managed to win the watch war. So how did they pull it off? Not through raw innovation, not through industrial efficiency, but through something far more Swiss. Patience, reputation, skill, and a very carefully maintained identity. That's what we're exploring today. And by the end, you'll also have a clearer sense of where different Swiss brands sit in that story, from the genuinely affordable to the seriously aspirational. So whatever your budget, you'll know what you're actually buying into. So, this is that story. Swiss watchmaking didn't begin in a gleaming workshop full of white glove artisans. It began with religion accidentally creating an industry. Picture Geneva in the 1500s. John Calvin arrived with his Protestant reforms and declared that decorative jewellery was a sign of vanity, spiritually problematic, morally suspect. If you were a goldsmith in Geneva at that moment, well, your entire livelihood had just become theologically awkward. But luckily, there was a loophole, which Calvin left open. Practical objects were fine. Useful things were acceptable. And nothing says I'm being disciplined, not vain, quite like a pocket watch. Watches helped you be on time for church, and they represented order, punctuality, virtues Calvin was very much in favour of. So the goldsmiths pivoted. They took their existing skills in working with tiny, intricate, precious metals and redirected them towards timekeeping. Calvin almost certainly didn't intend to launch a global industry, but then again, unintended consequences are kind of history speciality, isn't it? Guilds formed. Standards were established. Apprentices studied under masters, not for months, but for years. Precision became less of a technique and more of a cultural expectation. Geography then added its own ingredient. Up in the Jura Mountains, winters were 6 months of darkness where farming was simply impossible. So what do you do when you're snowed in for half the year with time on your hands? Well, apparently you make tiny gears by candlelight. One family would make the springs, another made escapements, someone else handled the cases. No factories, no assembly lines, just households across the mountains passing components to each other like a very slow, very cold relay race. Yeah, it was fragmented, it was inefficient, and it turned out to be remarkably resilient. Because Swiss watchmaking wasn't built on infrastructure, it was built on reputation. No family wanted to be known as one that made bad gear. As quality control system, pride turns out to be pretty effective. By the 1800s, the world wanted more watches, many more, and Switzerland faced genuine choice. Other countries, especially America, embraced industrialization completely. Mechanized factories, standardized parts, efficiency on a massive scale. American Watch Company could produce timepieces the way newspapers rolled off presses. Fast, consistent and cheap. Switzerland looked at all of that and said, well, we're going to keep doing it the slow way. They didn't ignore industrialization entirely. Parts became more industrialized, production volumes grew, but finishing remained handiwork. Aesthetics stayed conservative. Change arrived at the pace of a glacier, and Swiss glaciers are famously patient. And somewhere in this period, something important crystallized. The label Swiss made. At first, it was defensive, a way of saying this isn't one of those cheap foreign knockoffs. But gradually, Swiss made stopped being a geographic designation and became something more powerful. A promise. Not the fastest watch, not the most innovative maybe, but dependable, serious and correct. Switzerland learned pretty quickly that in watchmaking, what people believe about your product can be just as powerful as what your product actually does. Reputation, it turns out, once built carefully enough, becomes its own kind of precision instrument. Which brings us on to the moment when everything almost fell apart. Along came the 1970s, and with them, quartz. Cheaper, far more accurate, mass-produced at scale. Mostly from Japan, because Seiko looked at Swiss mechanical movements and essentially said, "Yeah, that's charming, now watch this." Quartz didn't just tell the time better, it told time precisely, with no winding, no daily adjustments. Accuracy measured in seconds per year rather than seconds per day. And it cost a fraction of the price. The Swiss watch industry didn't just stumble, it collapsed. Half the workforce just disappeared. Brands that had existed for generations closed. Entire mountain valleys that had made components for centuries suddenly had no orders to fill. The uncomfortable truth was that Switzerland didn't lose because it was behind technologically. It lost because it had convinced itself that mechanical precision was the point. Quartz proved it wasn't. The response came in two directions at once, and together they saved the industry. At the top end, prestigious houses like Patek and Rolex retreated further into luxury and heritage. They stopped selling accuracy and started selling meaning. Mechanical watches were reframed as objects of significance. Emotional artifacts connecting you to history, to craft, to something permanent in a world that suddenly felt very disposable. You didn't buy a mechanical watch because it keeps better time than your phone. You bought it because your grandfather had one, because you can see the movement through the case back, because holding something made by human hands feels different from holding something stamped out by a machine. At the other end, a businessman named Nicholas Hayek had a different idea entirely. Rather than retreating from cheap quartz, he decided to beat Japan at its own game, on Swiss soil. The result was Swatch, colourful, playful, affordable, and unashamedly mass-produced. Where the luxury houses said quartz is beneath us, Hayek said quartz is ours too. And it worked. Swatch didn't just survive the crisis, it helped rescue the broader Swiss watch industry by stabilising the supply chain that everyone from entry-level to ultra-luxury depended on. Switzerland hadn't beaten quartz, but it absorbed it, split it in two, and sent it back out into the world wearing completely different clothes. Which brings us to something that puzzles a lot of people about modern Swiss design. It never really changes, or it never seems to change. Car companies redesign their models every few years. New shapes, new features, new everything. Fashion brands do the same. But Swiss watch brands look at all of that and think, nah. And this isn't creative timidity, it's strategy. When a watch model looks almost identical to how it looked 30 years ago, that's not a sign that the company has run out of ideas. It's a sign that the company intends to exist for 30 more years. Continuity communicates stability, and stability communicates trust. Change, as it turns out, is dangerous in this industry, or can be. The quartz crisis burned that lesson into Swiss watchmakers' institutional memory. Innovation still happens, of course. In fact, new movements, new materials, new complications of extraordinarily technical ambition do happen, but quietly, inside the case, behind the dial, where it won't alarm anyone who bought the previous version. Swiss design philosophy doesn't want to surprise you, it wants to reassure you. And in the luxury world, reassurance is worth a great deal. This design ethos plays out differently across different brands, and each one tells you something distinct about this whole story holds together. So here's a brief tour across the price spectrum, because the Swiss approach to watchmaking doesn't belong exclusively to any one tier. Starting up the top with Patek Philippe. It doesn't really sell watches. Well, they sell stewardship. Their famous line, "You never actually own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation," is one of the most audacious pieces of marketing in history, and it worked. This watch isn't about you. You're a temporary caretaker in a long chain of heritage. It's a remarkable thing to tell someone spending 6 figures on a purchase, and somehow it lands just perfectly every time. And there are some really beautiful watches to choose from. Yeah, if you got the budget. Now, when you're looking at Swiss watches, you can't not mention Rolex, which is fascinating for a different reason. It operates at enormous industrial scale, nearly 1 million watches a year, and yet presents itself as timeless and almost handmade. Models don't get discontinued, they get refined. The Submariner today looks remarkably similar to the one from 1964, and that's entirely intentional. Rolex's actual product isn't steel or movement engineering, although they're great. It's certainty. The watch that will always mean something and looks good on wrist too. Next up is Certina, which sits at a more accessible price point but brings out a genuinely compelling engineering story with it. Their DS, double security, concept means reinforced cases, shock resistance and pressure testing built in as standard rather than bolted on as marketing. The DS Action Diver in particular has clear identity, a serious tool watch that doesn't ask you to spend serious money to own one. Certina is the kind of brand that doesn't get talked about often enough, which makes it one of the more useful recommendations on this list maybe. And if you want some Swiss robustness with instant name recognition, why not go for a Victorinox? Yeah, get yourself something to go with your Swiss Army knife. It's worth a look. The Inox model was designed to pass 130 military standard durability tests. Now that's not a number they made up for a brochure, it's a genuine engineering brief, and the watch looks like it means it. Which brings us to Tissot, which shows the same ethos and scales to everyday territory. They're affordable, widely available, produced in serious quantity, but still speak the language of Swiss heritage fluently. Tissot is many people's entry point to owning something with that Swiss-made caseback, and it wears a label without apology. Its heritage, it turns out, can be democratised, and they're great watches. For something maybe a little different, but at a similar price, and this is the recommendation you don't hear nearly often enough, consider Mondaine. Where most Swiss brands are selling heritage and robustness, Mondaine is selling clarity. Their watch design is lifted directly from Swiss Federal Railway's clock. A station clock designed on your wrist sounds like it really shouldn't work, but it just does. It's a piece of mid-century graphic design so clean and resolved that it's even been displayed in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Well, there you go. If your priority is a watch that looks genuinely considered rather than generically sporty, Mondaine earns a serious look, I think. Last is a watch brand that often gets criticised, but it takes affordability further still. Plastic cases, sure. Battery-powered movements, yes. Bold graphics that change with the seasons? Why not? On paper, the opposite of everything Swiss watchmaking stands for. And yet, Swatch is arguably the purest expression because it provided Swiss ethos was never really about materials or price. It's about belief. And Swatch understood something that luxury houses sometimes forget. Desirability isn't exclusive to expensive things. When Swatch collaborated with Omega, part of the same group, on the Moon Swatch collection, a quartz watch in a plastic case inspired queues around the block in cities around the world. People camping overnight for a £250 or so watch that shared DNA with one of the most iconic timepieces ever made. That's not budget product punching above its weight. That's the Swiss design philosophy working exactly as intended, just with the price tag removed. And Swatch get a lot of grief about their watches not lasting very long, but I tell you, I'm wearing a watch right now that I bought in the 1990s. It's still going strong. So, here's what actually happened. Switzerland didn't become the capital of time by being the most inventive. They weren't. Quartz proved that. They didn't get there by being the most efficient. They definitely weren't. America proved that. No, Switzerland became the capital of time by being believable. by turning precision into identity, by turning restraint into a virtue, by turning continuity into its own form of luxury, by surviving an existential crisis, not by competing harder, but by redefining what the competition was actually about. Other countries make watches. Switzerland makes them feel permanent. And in a world that updates, replaces and reboots itself every 18 months, that might be the most valuable thing anyone's managed to sell. So thanks for watching, everyone. And next time on Watches of the World, we're heading over to Germany, where they looked at what Switzerland built and said, well, that's nice. We'll take it from here, thanks. See you then.